thank you so much for joining us. So we'll dive right into it. Mike, I was really interested in learning about how you got interested in doing research about the Mexican American community here in Chicago, and you were telling me that one of your very first research trips was actually to research your grandmother. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in researching the community?
Definitely. Thank you, Elvia. Let me start by thanking the Chicago Sun-Times, WBZ Chicago, Printers Row Lit Fest, Elvia Malagón for being my co-presenter today. It's truly a privilege to be here with you. Yes, I'm not from Chicago. I'm born and raised in Los Angeles, California, but I grew up, as I was telling you earlier, with stories from my mother. My mother was an immigrant from Michoacan, and she would tell me stories about her own mother, who was born in Chicago in the early 19th, and she was born in 1930. So she was already a youngster growing up in Chicago in the height of the Great Depression. Her parents were immigrants from Mexico working on the railroad. And I found this really fascinating as somebody growing up in South Central LA. This was bizarre. I knew nothing of Chicago. And what was really striking was that what I understood is that my mother herself was an undocumented immigrant. And here she's telling me that her mother was an American citizen born in Chicago. So I found that really confusing. And as I got older, I decided to come here to Chicago, visit the city. I wasn't yet in grad school. I wasn't yet a historian, but I began to do archival research at the Cook County Records. I went to the parish where my grandmother would have lived, which was in South Chicago. I found her birth certificate. I found her baptismal record. And in the process, I discovered that Chicago was a very Mexican city. I go back to LA, I tell my mom what I found, she's excited, I'm excited. And really that's the root and the origins of my book, because although the book is not about my grandmother, it is about trying to historicize this immense community in an immense city that outside of Chicago, not a lot of other people know about. We have a lot of books on Chicanos in Los Angeles. We have a ton of books on Latinos in New York City. And we maybe only have, I don't know, Tim, maybe just a handful of books on Chicago's Latino communities. My editor's in the audience. So that's really the origins of that story, is really trying to historicize the city that my grandmother would have inherited, because one of the sad parts of that story is that my grandmother, along with her parents, were deported during the Great Depression. And so my grandmother, Ophelia, never returned to Chicago. She lived the rest of her life in Michoacan, an American-born citizen. It happened not just to her, it happened to thousands of Mexican-American children and their parents who were blamed for the economy in the 1930s and were deported or asked to repatriate to Mexico. And so there lies the roots of making Mexican Chicago.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that attracted me to your book. Was I don't think that there's enough stories about Midwest Latinos, so I really appreciate that. And diving right into the book, one of the areas that you focus on is the Near West Side, an area that Mexicans had been living in since the 1920s. And the book talks about how there was sort of this collision between urban renewal policies and immigration policies that were going on. Can you tell us a little bit about how those two forces came together to shape the Near West Side?
Absolutely. The Near West Side is a community we're actually not very far from. Like, it's just west of the Loop and home to UIC. In the book, I show how that community was one of the first target communities that Chicago would try to clear and redevelop using federal funding. This is typically called urban renewal and was part of a federal program after World War II to remake urban cities across America. And the City Hall tried to get some of that federal funding, and they chose the Near West Side as one of those communities. The Near West Side was a multi-ethnic and multiracial working class community. It had, of course, it had European descended immigrants. It had Italians. It also had African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and very many Mexicans. This was at one point in the 1920s and even into the 1940s, the largest Mexican enclave in Chicago. And so I begin the book with that community because that community puts in motion a type of instability and precarity that will exist and will follow, I argue, Mexican people in Chicago for the remainder of the 20th century. Urban renewal ends up displacing thousands of Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants. I focus on very many families, but one family in particular, the Guerreros. They were a community. They were a family that had actually a really beautiful building on Morgan Street, and I bring them up because a lot of the argument that the city would use to bulldoze some of these properties were that they were dilapidated, inferior. And when I researched the housing of the Guerreros, it was beautiful. I think you would all agree with me that if you were to see the photos, that we would all want to live in this home. It was like a 3-flat, beautiful brick building that had a just ornate rooftop. And they were very proud of it. They were homeowners, and they lost that building to the city and were displaced. So Elvia mentioned the kind of intersecting forces of immigration and urban renewal that occurred during this time. And so what I found was that along with Mexicans being displaced or threatened with displacement in the 1950s, they were also being threatened with deportation. This was a period of mass deportation raids by the federal government in what was called Operation Wetback. It was led by the INS in major cities throughout the United States. In Chicago, it begins on September 16th, 1954. I think people here might know what September 16th signifies to the Mexican community. So it was a very perverse kind of date to choose to initiate what would become month-long raids of the Mexican community. So I look at both of those things effectively displacing and erasing Mexican Near West Siders. And then from that point on, I pick up the story with those that begin to find properties to sell and to rent to Mexicans on the Lower West Side.
Yeah, and on the Near West Side, there were bulldozers that came through the community, but the book also touches on more subtle policies that were implemented to either flip a neighborhood a certain way or to keep the racial demographics of an area. Can you talk a little bit about what you found in your research?
Definitely. The book itself tries to get away from this idea that demographic neighborhood change is something that's natural, is something that is like, you know, one demographic group lives there for a little while, then they move out, and then another group comes in. And part of the reason for that is that I wanted to show the battles and the deliberate actions on behalf of stakeholders in different neighborhoods that either tried to Mexicanize neighborhoods or try to stop the Mexicanization of neighborhoods. And so in the back of the yards, for instance, I show how a very prominent neighborhood organization that we often associate with having progressive politics, a group that was started by Saul Alinsky, the Back of the Yards Neighborhood Council, actually becomes a group that is what we would call a defensive community group. They're careful as to managing where Mexicans will live. They make sure that the Mexican enclave doesn't get too big, that Mexican Americans can't live west of Ashland Avenue. And part of that story, I think, is really a kind of like a story of flipping the community or trying to prevent the flipping of a community. And by flip, we mean, trying to sell to one particular demographic group and to change that neighborhood. And so I looked to the kind of the stakeholders of these communities, and also on the flip side, Mexican American individuals and organizations that fought against that kind of hemming in or segregation or exclusion. And so it plays out in different particular ways throughout different neighborhoods. Pilsen, for example, is a case where real estate agents, and I write about one in particular, Anita Villarreal, who was a Mexican American from the Near West Side, enters the real estate industry, is one of the first Latina real estate agents that I could find in the city of Chicago in the 1950s and 60s, and really sees an opportunity in the displacement by actually trying to rent and buy and sell properties to Mexicanos right at the time that they're being displaced out of the Near West Side. She herself had been displaced, and so she knows how to talk to recent Mexican arrivals, but she's also skilled in talking to older white families that are looking to leave Pilsen, the heart of Chicago, Little Village, and she's able to pitch 2 different pitches in order to change these neighborhoods.
Yeah, and one of the more striking parts of the book centers around Mayor Richard J. Daley, the elder Daley's home in Bridgeport, where you had in the 1960s the civil rights activists who were there protesting in front of his home, and meanwhile Mexican-American civic leaders like Anita are sending him mariachis to serenade him for his birthday. I wondered if you could talk about how did the machine politics of Chicago affect people like Anita as they tried to gain influence and power in City Hall, and did it at all affect how involved they were in that civil rights era?
That's a great question, Elvia. 1966 is a very pivotal year in many cities, but particularly in Chicago. In that summer, Dr. Martin Luther King arrives to Chicago to protest the continued segregation of Black Americans, Black Chicagoans in particular, and leads these historic demonstrations throughout the Southwest Side and the Northwest Side. Perhaps some of you are familiar with this story. He infamously gets hit by a brick in Gage Park. It causes him to bleed. There's I kind of show an image in the maybe not in the book, but at least in the narrative of the book, in which in 1966 Black Chicagoans go to Bridgeport and protest Mayor Daley's house. This was not unusual. Activists who were fighting segregation as well as school inequality took to the streets and they protested in front of his house. What I mentioned in the book is that at the same year, Mexican American organizations also go to Bridgeport, not to protest Mayor Daley, but to serenade him on his birthday. And I found that striking, and I saw the images, and I wondered why when I was working on the book. And it was really an attempt to build bridges with Mayor Daley in the absence of any real political power, in the absence of having anyone in elected office that represented the interests of Latinos. And so this symbolic gesture to say, hey, Mayor Daley, we're also here and we're friendly, was playing up a little bit of the respectability politics. Now, 1966 is just shy of 1968. 1968 will be very different for Latino organizations who will actually take to the streets, engage in direct protest, and fight the segregation that they experience. But to get back to your great question, what I try to show in the book is that Mexican-American leaders were shaping a relationship to city power through the mayor, through the mayor's lieutenants, and trying to access city resources in a way that was informal, in a way that was not through your typical structures of power in kind of backroom deals. And the consequences of that relationship was that these middle brokers, these Mexican-American leaders, effectively curtail the electoral maturity of the Mexican community. This is a city that does not get elected Latino representation until the 1980s. That's very different from other Latino majority cities like Los Angeles or El Paso, right? San Antonio. And so I really wanted to try to give an answer to why that was. Why does it take till the 1980s to really elect, your Chuy Garcias, your Latino leaders, your Juan Solises? So it's because of this block of Mexican-American merchants and business people that create an alliance with Daley, but it's also Daley and the machine that really shuts out and excludes Latino political power for years and years and years.
And two neighborhoods that are mentioned in the book, which are still iconic Mexican neighborhoods, Pilsen and Little Village, it seems like during, maybe particularly like the 1970s, there is sort of a split in ideology towards gaining power. How do you think that ends up shaping how the neighborhoods are today? And can you talk a little bit about the differences for those that didn't read the book?
Thank you. Yeah. I show how these canonical Mexican neighborhoods in Chicago, Little Village, Pilsen, emerge as Mexican strongholds, but also diverge as different communities with different kinds of political priorities. And this divergence really takes off in, I would say, the late 1960s, early 1970s. In Pilsen, in this period, it has very active, very mobilized Mexican-American community organizations that are very weary and also leery of City Hall, of Mayor Daley, of the neglect of municipal resources entering the barrio. And so communities like Pilsen Neighbors mobilize to demand some access to resources. They demand better schools. They demand better public parks. And in the process, and they're right in doing so, they have an adversarial relationship with the mayor. Pilsen enters into the blueprints of the downtown business interests in what is a master plan called Chicago 21, which is threatening to remake Pilsen into a kind of luxury enclave. The renderings, the architectural renderings of Pilsen had this played out were fascinating. It shows these like condos along the riverfront, sailboats where you can ride your sailboat, then get off on the riverfront along Ashland and Cermak and walk to 18th Street where you can buy, some luxury goods. And this plan really mobilized the community and community activism to stop that plan, right? Of course, the plan works in other places. It remakes the South Loop and other areas. In Little Village, this becomes a domain of Anita Villarreal, the real estate broker that I mentioned earlier, she is kind of like the unofficial mayor of Mexican La Villita. She's somebody that is friendly with Mayor Daley. She's a real estate agent, so she's friendly with business interests. She, in many ways, remakes 26th Street by bringing in Mexican merchants to set up shop and thrive to be profitable on 26th Street. And she builds one of the most influential and powerful and successful real estate companies. And in that way, she builds a connection to the machine that in which she's not going to rock the boat. She's not going to unseat the alderman who is the longtime white alderman of South Lawndale. And she's going to welcome the free market, free enterprise, businesses, whoever wants to come in and set up and spend money in La Villita. These are words that are dangerous to Pilsen and Pilsenites in this period. They're very suspect of any kind of corporate grant that is going to play a role in redeveloping any of the housing or any of the public works projects in Pilsen. And so the two communities really diverge in the 1970s. Even the way they talk about tourism and bringing in more visitors from outside is very different for the two communities. And I think you're right to point out that the legacies of that divergence live on today.
And the book provided a pretty nuanced look at Latinos' views on politics. And it talked about the conservatism that was growing decades ago. And I know recently we've kind of seen more analysis of that, especially during the Trump era. But yeah, how was that building in particular on the Southwest side and in Little Village?
Definitely, yeah. I think that in order to kind of try to address the conservative aspect of Latinos in these communities at this time, which it does exist, we have to kind of take a step back to see just how different the Democratic Party was in Chicago from the National Democratic Party, right? This is the party of JFK, of LBJ. Civil rights legislation gets passed during LBJ's time because it's pushed by the civil rights movement. But a lot of these issues are hotly contested in Chicago. And Mayor Daley is almost kind of in between different political aspirations. A lot of the kind of older white ethnic communities of the central city don't want open housing. They don't want the Fair Housing Act. And Daley has to kind of try to appease different constituents. At the same time, Mexican Americans, in particular those that build a relationship with Mayor Daley, are not the kind of Mexican Americans that are going to join, say, something like the Chicano movement or some kind of direct action movement that is spouting kind of like self-deterministic politics. They're going to speak in terms of like Mayor Daley. They're going to talk about, you know, earning your place in America, earning your right to be a homeowner, this kind of bootstrap ideology that really is embraced, not by everybody, but by a big portion of the Southwest Side's Mexican American communities. And I think that while those ideologies are constantly challenged by community activists, by policies that are dangerous to Latinos, it is, I see at least a through line there between that kind of small-scale neighborhood conservatism and almost like a frustration with electoral politics and you know, the eventual, what I mentioned in the book is that Anita Villarreal, who begins her life as a New Dealer, a believer in Roosevelt, a believer in that the government can do good in the 1940s and 50s, ends up voting for Ronald Reagan in 1980, and ends up really embracing kind of that modern conservatism of the late 20th century. And I think that's not unique to Anita, but something that is widely embraced in the Bungalow Belt.
And what do you think was the relationship, or did your research get into this, the relationship between Black residents and Mexican residents? Because it was mentioned that Mexicans were often used as a buffer, especially when talking about North Lawndale and South Lawndale.
That's an excellent question, and one that I think Chicago still grapples with when it comes to kind of Black-Brown relations and areas of coalition building. In the book, I show that part of the fears that I think really dominated the thinking of kind of older white ethnic communities in the Lower West Side and the Southwest Side was really rooted in kind of anti-Black racism. It was rooted in stopping the arrival of Black homebuyers, Black families. And so Mexicans, and this isn't always the case, but in many cases, they become the preferred group to allow some kind of settlement in the community. And when I was talking about the back of the yards earlier, and the attempt to prevent Mexican Americans from crossing Ashland Avenue, but eventually they do, is that the belief there on the part of white families was that the minute Mexican Americans can buy west of Ashland Avenue is the minute that Ashland Avenue as a dividing street, as a buffer, as a border, really erodes and allows for the arrival of Black families. Keep in mind that at this time in the 1940s and 50s, the Black South Side and Bronzeville, this is an area that is overpopulated. There's a housing crunch. Black families can, in many respects, afford a home in the Southwest Side, but are not allowed to buy homes, right? And so there's a kind of managing of that demographic diversity. And I try to show it as carefully as I can with the records that I was able to find. But it is an enduring kind of struggle, I believe, in our 21st century moment, right? We still don't have, I think, we have the areas of commonality. We just don't have the will so far to build the kind of coalition around housing justice between minority communities that could really try to address the issues these communities are experiencing today. But I think a lot of the roots lay in this early management of neighborhood change.
Yeah, and when you talk about back of the yards, there was a part where it was mentioned that during a period where a lot of Americans were building wealth and starting to form that sort of eventual generational wealth that gets passed on, people in back of the yards were really struggling with that. Can you talk a little bit more about what was it that was really the things that were holding them back from being able to do that?
Yeah, I mean, the back of the yards is not just a community we understand here in Chicago, but nationally, it's, this is the setting of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, right? Why? Because this was the setting for America's meat production, the meat packing plants that produced meat for the nation and the world. Those meat packing plants eventually go away. They close up shop and they go to another country. This begins in the 1950s, extends into the 1970s. These are the decades in which Mexican Americans are finally gaining a foothold in the back of the yards, even moving into Gage Park and areas that used to provide a kind of social mobility that could really set you up and your family for decades, right? They don't end up experiencing that social mobility. The meatpacking plants close. Industry is leaving the city, and so families have to kind of do more with less. the value of their properties is not as high as it once was for previous generations. And so I show that struggle of those families in the back of the yards, and the kinds of stigmas that come from being poor and living in a poor community, right? This is an infamous thing that happens in urban America, where we blame people for being poor, right? And so the policies that come from that are policies that are not really meant to elevate them, but to continue to blame them. So I try to show the nuances of that, but also, you know, the effects of the economy and the kind of economic restructuring that's happening throughout all Chicago in the 1970s and 80s.
Yeah, and ahead of this, there were quite a number of people that submitted questions. A lot of them had to do around gentrification, so I was going to read off one of them that was pretty good. With an increasing number of transplants gentrifying the city as developers continue their overhaul of Black and brown communities, driving rent and taxes sky high, what can we take from the author's historical analysis as tools to resist and interrupt this housing injustice?
That's a great question. You know, my thinking around current gentrification is really guided by just the past. I'm a historian, so I think about what's already happened. And many of the questions that I think people are asking today about how do we stop this? What can we do to keep kind of like wealth displacement from happening in communities, working class communities, I think is an age-old question. Community activists in Pilsen in the 1970s were asking that. They were asking, will there be a kind of Mexican community here in 20 years? And part of the solutions that they had at the time was really to build housing, and this is again in the 70s and 80s, for working class people. Build housing that would not displace, and this was the motto that they would use, is development without displacement, right? How do we build without displacing people? And I think that initially a lot of community organizations, I mean there was many, tried to do this in the 1980s. They tried to build homes, apartment units that would be well within the reach of kind of wage-earning working class families. But the incentive structure created at the national level and at the state level and at the city level really challenged community organizations. And what I mean by that is that private money, kind of a neoliberal apparatus of allowing corporate money to dictate community development, begins to take off in the 1980s in ways that it dictates to the community organizations what they can and cannot do. The city created incentive structures. One of them is infamous, and it's known as TIF, the tax increment financing system, which is it's supposed to help bring development to areas that are hard hit by lack of development. But what it does is it actually incentivizes venture capitalists, people that are faceless, people that are not even going to live there, that are going to make a profit off of the housing that they're going to build, right? And you know, this is not to blame the city per se, but this is really to alert our generation now that is fighting against gentrification to say, hey, where are the checks and balances on this? Where is the fight for creating an incentive for communities of color and working class communities to remain in those communities? And I feel like we don't have enough of that conversation. Chicago is the city of neighborhoods, right? But who gets to live in those neighborhoods? Who gets to stay in those neighborhoods? I think that that's a question that remains vital to ask today for many communities, not just Pilsen and Little Village. This is a state that has been quite hostile to rent control and to rent stabilization, not because the city council doesn't support it, but because The state policy has already banned it in the 90s. They banned the ability to fight for rent control. So we need to ask those questions. Why? You know, why have we banned rent stabilization when other cities have been able to really successfully enact those policies and keep people in the Bronx and keep people in parts of Brooklyn, right? So there's a lot to talk about when it comes to gentrification. I think the book is a history book, right? So the book talks about the role players and the structures in place that really created the age of gentrification, you know, and I show it through the kind of studies that the city did in the late 1960s and early 1970s of Pilsen, but many other communities, of Bronzeville, of Southside communities. These studies were called market analysis studies. I mean, it's in the title. How do you make these neighborhoods profitable? And the thinking behind that is that some bodies are worth more than other bodies in certain spaces, right? And so I try to contribute to that conversation, but yes, there are definitely a lot of different topics and solutions and things that ought to be talked about when it comes to gentrification.
Yeah, it was kind of surreal reading it because here we're still regularly at the Sun-Times report on that. A couple weeks ago, recently, there was people who were trying to do exactly what you were talking about in Uptown, so just kind of surreal. But there was also a question that focused on when thinking about gentrification, there are people who think it's bad and want to resist it, but there's also an ideology that it might not be so bad. Can you talk a little bit about that and where that comes from?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I grew up in LA where I remember on my block, some of the community members felt it was a good thing that USC, which is the community kind of where I lived, was expanding into our neighborhood. Oh yes, USC is building a parking lot near us, and they're gonna build an arena kind of near us, and that's gonna bring a lot more money and maybe students living in our neighborhood. So yeah, that was when I was growing up, but I found similar kinds of feelings around in my research when I was researching longtime community members in Pilsen who did believe that UIC's expansion or TIF would actually help them because it would indeed raise their property value. And in many ways, I had a lot of compassion for that argument because I knew that these families had survived decades of disinvestment, decades of moments when there was a total neglect from the city. There was no interest in bettering the parks or building new schools or doing regular trash pickup. So I got that part of it. But at the same time, I think folks that believed that gentrification was a positive thing, I think we're seeing it at a very individual level. It benefits my property. When I think really the story is that it has consequences for displacing that person and their neighbors because, you know, we don't have, and this goes back to the kind of like what are the solutions to stop wealth gentrification? People think that their property values are going to go up and that they're going to be able to kind of keep up with paying the kind of assessment of those property values. But in actuality, those assessments, they become too high for even working homeowners in these neighborhoods to pay an annual property tax, right? And the burden is really too high for these families. So we need, I think, you know, this is me on my soapbox, but I think we need to create policy that addresses the kind of long-term residents, the long-term homeowners, and the property taxes that are applied to those residents, as well as, of course, rent stabilization. But indeed, yeah, there are people that do believe that gentrification is a positive thing.
And this is more of a technical question, but the book mentions how the documentation itself of the Mexican community sometimes was maybe not fully accurate. Like there was an example that sometimes maybe either the landlord or the tenant would not say how many people actually live somewhere to hide that there was overcrowding. How, as a historian, did you grapple with that as you're piecing things together? And is there anything that maybe wasn't on paper that you couldn't track down that you wish you would have been able to?
Yes. So let me answer the first part of your question. You know, when you're a historian of Mexican immigration and Mexican immigrants and the communities they make and build, you're gonna struggle with paperwork because this is a generalization, but in many ways, you know, they evade paperwork. They don't want to be documented in these particular ways, right? And I think, Elvia, what you're talking about is the landlords that would not say or clearly tell the city how many units were in their building and how many tenants were in those units. And that's a very Chicago urban history story of kind of trying to squeeze in more bodies into smaller and smaller apartments. But at the same time, I think people do want their stories told. And I was able to not only use the archival institutions in Chicago to tell this story, but I knocked on doors, I interviewed people, I used the snowball method to ask people to talk to me about their history, share documents with me, share property deeds with me. And in that way, I was able to find out just how expensive homes were to Latinos in periods of time when the housing property value was not super high. So this is a common story in African American urban history where African American working people have to spend way more money to buy a home in an area in which that home is not as valuable for what they're asking for, right? This is usually, this is not like the contract selling, but just to purchase a home. And this was the case for Latinos, and I talk about this kind of third housing market. And the way I was able to get at that is really through scanning people's like housing deeds and looking at the value of the home and then measuring that up against what was the value of this neighborhood at the time. Were there things that I wasn't able to get to or get access to? Absolutely. I mean, you know, the daily papers, the Richard J. Daily papers, when they were released in around 2013 or 2014, they didn't have the kind of things that I was really looking for. I don't know why, I don't know where they went, but I had to go to a lot of other places to try to find the city administration's policy decision-making on housing at the time. There was the Chicago Dwellings Association that was really pivotal in creating new housing on the Southwest Side. And I wasn't able to really track down a lot of that archival work. So yeah, I mean, if I could do it over again, and I think like both my partner sitting here and my editor, Tim Manel, they would probably be like, no, just this, get it done now, put a period on it. But this could have taken me like another 10 or 15 more years had I searched for those documents, yeah.
And I do want to open it up for any questions in the audience. Unfortunately, we don't have a mic, but if you could kind of stand up and ask your question as loud as possible.
Schools. Yes, the question is about the importance of just the Mexican families and the children, those families that go to school, and having schools that attend to bilingual education, bicultural education. Absolutely. you know, people outside of Chicago don't really understand this, but Chicago had a vital Chicana and Chicano movement in the 1960s and 70s that was in part influenced, of course, by civil rights, by the Chicano movements of the Southwest. And in that movement itself, it had a firm belief in addressing social inequality in the schools and challenging the curriculum of the Chicago Public School District. These were schools that were very harsh if you were a Mexican immigrant kid or just a Latino kid that didn't speak English very well or only spoke Spanish. You would be punished for speaking Spanish. And the Chicana and Chicano movement really pushed to adopt bilingual and bicultural education. This is a fight that happened nationally, but also locally. And locally here in Chicago, it was one of the fruits of that fight was really the establishment of Benito Juarez High School, which had a total like Chicano movement curriculum. I mean, the teachers were bilingual speaking. The curriculum itself centered on the lives of children that were growing up in a bilingual world, right? And it valued their Spanish language heritage. And in those ways, it really pushed the needle on the conversation that I think is, you know, today in the 2020s, that's like, no duh, we want that. Of course we want that. But in the 1970s, that was a fight. And it really had to be pushed on the ground by parents, by young people, who really mobilized the community to want this and to fight for this. So that's a terrific question. I hope I touched on what you were getting at. Absolutely. I agree 100% with you. Thank you.
So I miscalculated the time a bit, and I think we're running out of time, actually. But will you be sticking around?
I'll stick around. I'll answer any questions people have. The book is here at the University of Chicago Press, and you're holding up the book, and she's holding up the book. Thank you. I'll be signing the book. I think it's on sale today, so please pick it up if you want to read more, or just talk to me, and we'll chat. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, actually, Erica did tell me that we have time for one more.
Oh,
so
yes,
I'll,
yes.
Yeah, hi. Wanted to thank you for being here. Really interesting conversation, but I interesting. I've gotten really interested in housing and the solutions to the problems that we're facing as a city. And some organizations have talked about TIF as a solution if it has community agreements. I tend to kind of be on the side of caution, and I don't know if you know much about that, but it's something that I've kind of been thinking a lot about. So any thoughts would be great.
Thank you. Yes. So a kind of like addendum to TIF, if it has a community agreement. I think I have heard a little bit about that. Thankfully, I have some awesome undergrads from Chicago at Georgetown that tell me about this. And yeah, I don't know enough to know whether that's really good or really bad, but TIF, in my view, if we just judge it by the past 2 decades, then I would conclude that it's been a bad thing so far, that it's been weaponized to really create a kind of luxury enclave in Pilsen that is inaccessible to working people, and yet it uses incentives, right, that are supposed to be built for those communities in there, because you know it's supposed to kind of pay itself later, but really it has this dangerous effect of raising property values and displacing people, and the housing that gets built is really inaccessible in terms of affordability to any working wage earning resident. So I would have to look more into the community agreements, but absolutely we need to think outside the box in terms of like, what are some things in place that we can put so that we don't displace working class people in these communities, what kind of city do we want? What kind of Chicago do we want? I mean, is it just an endless remaking of the central city that just does not have the kind of working base that the city needs anyway? Like, I mean, the city needs its workers, right? And those workers need a place to live. And they can't all just be commuting from far away, the outskirts of the city. And so, yes, I think we need to your point, we need to kind of check for the receipts on that partnership, and we also need to keep thinking outside the box on how to reimagine Chicago's communities and who can live here. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I want to thank Mike for coming here. For those who don't know, he came all the way from Washington, D.C. to be here today, so thank you so much. I want to thank the Chicago Community Trust. My position at the Sun-Times is funded through them, so thanks to their generosity, my stories aren't behind a paywall. But we do encourage you to support local journalism, and you could do that by getting a subscription with the Chicago Sun-Times. So thank you so much, everyone. Hope you have a great day.
And how lucky we are to have Elvia Malagón in the Chicago Sun-Times documenting these communities. Thank you so much.